Welcome everybody to the session 82 of the IUSSP IPC conference. I'm really excited to invite everybody who's going to be speaking on this panel. And our topic of discussion today is rising inequality acceptable if it coincides with poverty reduction. And we'll take the developing country kind of angle, but then hoping to have some input from US and EU and maybe Australian contexts as well. And so we're not going to be a traditional academic session, it's more going to be discussion style. So what we're going to do is we're going to open with Under David, and she's going to give a 10-minute presentation. And then this is going to be followed by brief comments from Murray Librand, Kanika Mahajan, Marcello Neri, and Nkechi Owu. So I'll keep everybody moving along to keep on time. So this will give us a lot of time for discussion afterwards, which I'm sure everybody will really enjoy. So without further ado, I'll invite Anda to unmute, and she's going to have a few slides as well. And I'll put my stopwatch on, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So I look forward to hearing how you open our session, Anda.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can see my screen well. And thank you so much to the IUSSP and also to the Population Poverty and Inequality panel for having me in the session, and also for proposing such a cheeky theme for the session. And I'll try to give a few elements on why I think that the short answer to the question is no, but also a few elements I hope that will feed into the discussion of my colleagues afterwards. But first, I would just like to start with a few basic things on why poverty and inequality are a little bit the same, but still different. And one of the starting points of our discussion, I think, should be the fact that reducing inequalities not only has, I would say, ethical grounds, but it's also instrumental for poverty reduction. And actually, we can think of poverty as an outcome of inequality. Nevertheless, inequality is much harder to reduce than poverty, as it is a phenomenon with extremely high inertia. And this is due to actually two main things. On the one hand side, it's due to the fact that the intergenerational transmission of status is very strong, and therefore the asset distribution is quite persistent. On the other hand side, the crucial elements or factors that shape inequality, such as social norms, institutions, or again, political regimes, take very long time to change. And another difficulty or difference is also that inequality actually lacks the normative and commonly acknowledged approach that poverty has. We don't know how to target inequality. We know, or more or less actually, who is poor. A person can be poor, but she cannot be unequal. So actually, from this, there are various questions that stem. We know that we want to eliminate extreme poverty, but when it comes to inequality, by how much should we reduce it? Should we or should we not aim for outcome equality? We usually say that we shouldn't aim for perfect income equality, but then which are the outcomes for which we should aim for equality? And this also brings us to another question, which is, what is the kind of inequality that actually matters to people? Inequality is a relative concept with changing boundaries, and therefore there's no universal norm to it. So finally, in the question of whether rising inequality is acceptable if it comes with poverty reduction, which is the inequality that we are talking about? Is it inequality in terms of outcomes or of opportunities? Is it economic, or is it social? Is it vertical or horizontal inequality that we are talking about? Now, me being an economist, I will take the narrow view of economic inequality and probably precise the question as, is income inequality acceptable if it coincides with poverty reduction? And we have a very famous, I would say, framework when we talk about this in economics. And actually here I took it from one of Murray's presentations, which is the poverty inequality growth nexus. And what it tells us is that growth and distributional changes, hence inequality reduction, matter both for poverty reduction. It also tells us that inequality matters a lot for growth, and that the nature of growth and the way it's shaped by inequality will be a huge determinant of its capacity to reduce poverty. So even if today we find ourselves in a situation where poverty reduction coincides with rising inequality, it will surely not be the case tomorrow, as the increase in inequality will deter the growth that made poverty reduction today possible. And the study from the World Bank actually shows that if the Gini index of each country decreases by 1% per year, the global poverty rate could be reduced to around 6.3% in 2030. This means that poverty reduction even today could be a lot higher with less inequality. Now, another reason why rising inequality should not be acceptable, even if in the context of poverty reduction, is that inequalities are an obstacle to social mobility, and therefore they create poverty traps. Inequalities withhold poor individuals from investing in their human capital and deprive them from the opportunities to ascend socially. This is what has been observed and described as the Great Gatsby curve that you see here, which actually tells us that countries with high inequality are also countries with low social mobility and high intergenerational transmission of poverty. So inequality hinders social mobility and perpetuates poverty. But it's also true, as Benabu and Oke show, that people care less about inequality if they know that the prospects of their children climbing up the poverty, up the social ladder are positive. So beyond just observing what happens to inequality while poverty is decreasing, it's also important for us to know how people perceive inequalities. And the recent study from the OECD shows that in the OECD countries, 4 out of 5 people feel that income disparities are too large, so that inequality is too important in their countries. Now, it's not only that, but they also say that they prefer lower economic disparities. And this is even true for very unequal countries. And we've done a study in Mexico with Colmex and Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias on how Mexicans perceive inequalities and social mobilities. And again, we find a very similar result with, on average, people perceiving rather correctly the level of inequalities and expressing a desire for a considerably less unequal society. It doesn't mean that they would like a level of inequality which would be extremely low or even comparable to the European Nordic countries, but a level of inequality which is for Gini of around 0.3, similar to, for instance, that of France. So we have to think about how people perceive inequalities, no matter whether the observed inequalities are increasing or decreasing. And the reason why perceptions are quite important is also linked to the question and to the fact that we need to ask ourselves, acceptable for whom? Because the question of perceptions of acceptance is getting more and more traction. It matters a lot for preferences for distribution and for how policy changes and how policies are made. And it's even more important right now because in the times that we are living, we see that there is an important, I would say, questioning of experts. So we need to think very deeply about acceptable for whom, and also about what can we actually do about it. We have seen that we know which are the receipts for reducing inequalities, but inequalities are still increasing. We are not able to eliminate extreme poverty as we are supposed to. We also need to think about what we are doing and how people perceive that. And just to end, a couple of additional reasons on why I think the answer should be no is also that we would need to question what we actually mean by poverty reduction. And it also brings us to the question of the reliability of the poverty measures that we often use. One of the reasons is that quite often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized are left behind in the surveys and the measures that we use. Also, another reason is that often we talk about income poverty, but we do know how important multidimensional poverty is, and that even if income poverty is decreasing, it might not be the case for multidimensional poverty. Linked to that is also the work around the hidden dimensions of poverty, and HD Fourth World did some incredible work recently on dimensions of poverty which go beyond the multidimensional poverty framework of Sabina Al-Khair and her colleagues. And there they look at also questions of how poor people perceive themselves, how they are treated by institutions, etc. So poverty goes much beyond the income dimensions, but beyond the economic dimensions, and it's strongly linked to others. And I would say that, again, the question of acceptance and the role that experts play, it's not easily defendable quite often. So the question that we see very often, and me speaking as someone that works in development cooperation and development institutions, I see very often on who decides what is acceptable and how this matters for policy making. So I will stop here. I hope I haven't gone too much beyond my 10 minutes, and thank you so much.
Perfect as always, Anda. Thank you so much. And thank you for drawing out that when we're considering inequality, we're also considering the ethics of inequality and poverty. And not just the mechanics of it and how they're connected. So thank you for that. So we'll move to our next speaker, who's going to be Murray. So Murray, let's hear your 5 minutes of discussion bouncing off Anders there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to add some comments in to that very nice opening presentation. And I guess, so I want to start by saying that that this isn't this issue that we're tabling has a very long-standing tradition in development economics, and there's been ferocious debates, but they've been driven more by dogmatism and less by pragmatism. And what I want to do in my comments is just to say this is a very important and consequential discussion. And I'm referring to the African context and just bringing some facts of the African context to bear in answering the question. At the end of the day, my answer being very similar to what Anders saying, but what the point I want to make is it depends upon the context. So Africa since 2000 has had a very broke the shackles of the past with its sluggish growth rates and had amongst the fastest growing countries in the world, actually. So we had a strong growth trend. And that was sort of very liberating given a long period of no growth at all. And so we do have a strong aversion to no growth, and we have a strong sense that growth is an important thing to discuss. You're not playing at the margins of how much growth do we want. That's not the African context. That doesn't mean that this issue we're discussing isn't important. Because at the same time, in the African context, it is also the context in which that dominates the world poverty discussion, actually. It has the bulk of the world's poor, the bulk of the world's extreme poor. And so this is a very important discussion. So what actually was the experience then of this growth experience that we had over the last while? In terms of poverty reduction, the so-called growth poverty elasticity. Now, the experience in the African context was disappointing, actually. So the growth, the fact that we had this positive growth makes it very hard for African context to understand that actually the returns in terms of poverty reduction were extremely disappointing, about less than a half of the returns, for example, per increment of growth that we were getting in East Asia and the Pacific, or even the developed countries from the increments of growth, and Latin America, less than half of all of those contexts. Only Middle East and North Africa had a very strong relationship between growth and poverty reduction. And so that makes the question very real. Why was that? And that's where the context came in, that triangle that underput together with the inequality, growth, and poverty nexus together. Because why did Africa get such a low return on its growth? And you know, at the same time, there are pockets of Africa that are extremely highly unequal, Southern Africa in particular, but there are pockets that are very much standard levels of inequality. But nonetheless, what inequality brings to this discussion is the texture of the society, what the people, what their human capital, what they have to bring to the economy, and therefore how can they be included in the growth process. And so that's been highlighted then as the sort of key connection between the growth process and then the actual poverty reduction process. And so the fact that African economies are very high informal sector economies, so the usual, you know, very high export growth translates in very complicated ways into actual poverty reduction that depends upon how agriculture works, for example, how informal sector labor markets work, whether young people actually, they've got very good human capital characteristics in the African context, they're boosted a lot, but can they come in with the gender actual norms, etc.? What is the institutional context around the economy? And the COVID pandemic has certainly sharpened that greatly, because it's shown very clearly that the vulnerable within the African context have borne the consequences of the declining economic activity. There's a link that needs to be grappled with between people and their livelihoods and their human capital characteristics and the economy. And it's very sharp in any African context, because it's not just a formal sector economy. It's an agricultural economy, it's an informal urban economy. And so the COVID, now we're in a different environment. Now we're talking about rekindling growth and rekindling the development trajectory having been decimated by COVID. And what have we got to work with here? We do still, growth depends upon capital and labor in any growth model that you care to bring to bear. And what do African economies have to bring to bear? They have the productivity of their people as the primary thing. And so the points, the focus definitely has been sharpened about the fact that actually you need to use, it's not a theoretical discussion of trading off, you know, levels of growth and inequality, et cetera, et cetera. The inequalities are hindering growth and hindering our way forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Murray. That was really illuminating to hear about this sort of the returns on growth for poverty reduction through this growth poverty elasticity. I found that very interesting that you brought that out. And it's sad for the whole world that COVID is exaggerating all of the sort of disappointments for the fact that you've mentioned that the returns on growth for the reduction in poverty was very low in sub-Saharan Africa, and then COVID is exaggerating that. Yeah, it's going to be a slow process forward. So thank you for your contributions on that. I think it helps us understand what we're up against a lot better. So now we're going to switch continents now, and so inviting Kanika to enlighten us about the South Asian context. Thanks, Kanika.
Is my screen visible? This one? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this session. So in short, my answer actually would coincide with what the others have already said in terms of not agreeing with this, that rising inequality should be acceptable, even if there is accompanying poverty reduction that's happening along with rising inequality. So just to give some context here, India as a country, if you look at any World Inequality Report or any of those reports, you would see that India probably captures one of the highest. The Gini coefficient in India is roughly around 50. It is one of the highest in the world. However, what generally goes less noticed is what is the type of inequality that we're talking about here. Are we talking about earnings inequality? Are we talking about wealth inequality? Because some of our own research has shown that, we know that wealth inequality is, and total income inequality is more difficult to capture. But if one is just trying to look at earnings inequality from employment or just from wage employment, then actually the last 2 or 3 decades in India, which have been accompanied by a very high growth rate in per capita GDP. So the growth rate in India between 2004 and 2011 was around 6% per annum. And that between 2011 and 2017 has also been around 5.5% per annum, has been accompanied by a decline in wage earnings inequality. And at the same time, the poverty reduction has even been higher than what has been the decline in wage earnings. Now, of course, when it comes to income earnings, depending on the data that you use, you'll always find that either like inequality has been same, or at least in the last 2 decades, it has been rising when it comes to total income inequality, because that also includes wealth inequality to a large extent. So there is this dichotomy, at least in India, between a much faster rising wealth inequality as compared to, say, wage earnings inequality. And one contributor to this dichotomy has actually been the government policy, where minimum wages have been increasing in the country over the last 15, 20 years. And some of our own research actually shows that this rising minimum wages has actually led to a decline in the wage earnings inequality. Even the wealth inequality has increased. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that the last 2 decades in India, which have been accompanied by high rate of GDP growth, high income growth, have been accompanied by a decline in wage earnings inequality, just because of the policies which have accompanied this high growth stage. So it is possible that you have high growth rate, but at the same time you have policies that sort of bring down inequality. In this case, it was only wage earnings inequality. It didn't really translate into wealth inequality. And in general, if one looks at the empirical literature, we know that when we talk about poverty reduction itself, one way of poverty reduction is increase in per capita GDP, but the other way is also by reducing income inequality. And it's only when the gains from the income growth are not equally divided that we actually see a rise in inequality. And when there is such a rise in inequality, the question that also comes up is this high growth sustainable in the long run? Does it have implications for sustainability of growth that one would also want? And here, existing research has shown that even if you want future, if you look at how poverty responds to mean incomes, that itself is dependent on the initial level of inequality. So if your initial level of inequality is lower, the sensitivity of your poverty reduction to economic growth is actually higher. So there are a lot of studies which have actually shown this thing. So inequality just matters for growth as well. Apart from, of course, there are ethical considerations, in terms of, in this debate, but just, I think just even mechanically or even just quantitatively, there's a big role that inequality sort of plays even in future returns that you reap from economic growth. The second thing that the literature has found is that the elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to income inequality is actually greater than the elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to increase in mean incomes, which again clearly shows that that reduction in inequality has to go hand in hand with rise in incomes if you even care about poverty reduction in the long term. And I think the reason why economists have probably been concerned with the fact that it's okay to have high inequality, forget about the ethical considerations for some time, but maybe it's okay because at least you have poverty reduction happening. And to some extent, this has been borne by the fact that we're not sure what are the effects of inequality on growth itself. And here again, because we worry that there could be private investments that could come down if you really try to reduce inequality. However, there are no sort of no perfect results in the literature here. So again, I don't think that's a consideration that we should really care too much about, because there are other effects of inequality which can be much worse. For instance, you can have increased conflict. There can be increased social unrest, which itself can translate into lower economic growth later if inequality is not nibbed or if it's not reduced. So these are some of the points that I wanted to bring to the table in terms of my opinion or what I think. So let me just stop here.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Josephine. Yeah.
Okay. Great. So thank you so much, Kanika. I thought that was really interesting that from the Indian context to really draw out that wealth inequality versus the wage inequality. And then towards the end of your discussion, again, looping back into sort of the ethics of inequality and that there are social consequences, the social unrest that can come with rising inequalities. So thank you for that. It's really fascinating to hear all these different contexts. So now we're going to go over to South America, and Marcello, you can take us on that journey.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real great pleasure to be with you again. Especially in this well-equipped and diverse group of people from all around the globe. So my answer follows Luigi Pirandello play names, So It Is, If You Think So, or more likely, So It Is Not, If I Think It's Not. I'll try to explain that. In other words, everything depends if inequality measure used is acceptable, and the same thing for poverty. So let me try to explain the points. I'll try to mix a little bit Brazilian background with some of these points raised by Anda. First, assuming the question of inequality of what is answered satisfactorily. So for example, skipping the fundamental difference between inequality of opportunities versus inequality of results, namely income or consumption inequality. So we skip that. For example, in the domain of inequality of results, if it incorporates regional prices, imputation of public services, etc., you can have a better measure than other. Nevertheless, the question posed tend to bring us close to the per capita income concepts that are connected with the traditional poverty literature. So the answer is no, due to within household inequality that's thrown away by assumption. In particular, per capita income is by construction blind to gender income inequality issues, at least within households. So that's why maybe it's important to look at different indicators. Like SDGs have gender inequality measures. Second, a simple point, if we depart from very high inequality levels like Brazilian or South African style, the answer tends to be no as well. And inequality gets entrenched. If it's very high, you get this sort of inertia, but it's context specific. This part. The third point reminds me of François Bourguignon's speech in this group 1 year ago. If income measurement period is shorter, for example, monthly in the case of Brazil, as annual in the terms of in the US, for instance, we tend to mix in measure inequality rising temporal volatility. So this brings about the issue if we are talking about true inequality across different people, or more about the dispersion of the same persons facing across time periods. So the consequences of volatility depends on how much people are able to smooth these fluctuations in their living standards across time. So if people are not just able to smooth that, the answer is no again. Fourth, and perhaps more relevant, all the inequality measures used, and I'm assuming we're talking about income inequality at this point, like Gini, Atkinson, etc., they are directly derived from a series of values and principles embedded in the social welfare function. Even the share prosperity, the bottom 40% share in income, that's used because it gets the bottom by definition, can be derived in this approach. So inequality can also be derived from poverty measure. That would be the social welfare function in this case. So it's a like mother, like daughter type of approach. So the two concepts can be made very consistent between them. You can derive inequality from poverty, but if they are from, it doesn't matter. So just two last points related with the new literature in inequality that are on the rise. As Anda mentioned, subjective measures of inequality, perhaps individual, and then you take the inequality out of that. For example, perceived health status, as the World Health Organization uses, is a way to incorporate, for example, gender-related inequality with its own problems of adaptation, etc., related to perceptions. But I agree that perceptions is very important to take into account. And finally, top incomes related inequality. Income tax data reveals more unfairness, but also brings new resources and taxation opportunities for redistribution into the picture. So it becomes even more unacceptable having rising inequality. First, because inequality is higher than we thought before. And second, it comes with the opportunities to reduce poverty. Of course, you have efficiency problems, etc. But I think a very high inequality, like we have in Brazil, meaning there is a great opportunity to reduce poverty. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Marcella. I really appreciated your comment about this within household income inequality and sort of the gender dynamics, gender inequality that we can bring into the discussion there. So thank you for that, and reinforcing again that inequality is entrenched. And I thought your discussion of the rising temporal volatility was also very illuminating, and how that then loops to not only the mechanics of consumption smoothing, but sort of fueling the social unrest that and the ethics of inequality that the others have been talking about as well. So we are whizzing around the world, and we're going to loop back to Nkechi, and so over to you, Nkechi.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. I'm pleased to present my thoughts on this very interesting topic. So I'll start by saying that, as we all know, a lot of countries in Africa, as Maria already pointed out, over the past 2 decades have recorded impressive economic growth rates. But as we also know, the continent hasn't been able to reduce its poverty rates in commensurate proportions to the increases in growth. Now, the literature has some suggestions that perhaps poverty tends to be more resistant to economic growth where inequality is more prevalent. Now, I want to talk about the situation as it exists in the Ghanaian context. So in Ghana, over time, we have also seen impressive growth rates, particularly starting from about 2011, when we discovered and began to produce oil in commercial quantities. Now, at the national level, as you can see from the graph on the right, poverty has been declining. Whether you look at it by the lower poverty line or the upper poverty line, we see that between 2005 and using the most relevant data in 2017, poverty has been falling. However, the impact of growth on poverty, on the reduction in poverty, has been falling across 3 decades. The country is also characterized by rising inequality levels, as you can see by the Gini coefficients, the green bars, and then also using a different measure for inequality, the Thiel's index. But it's important to point out that these trends in poverty and inequality are not necessarily being experienced uniformly across the country. Now, on this slide, I'm showing you the poverty rates and then the inequality levels for each of the 10 regions of the country, and showing how this has changed over time between 2012 and then 2017. Now, what we notice is that in certain regions, like in the Greater Accra region, the Ashanti region, Eastern region, we see declines in poverty over time, also declines in inequality. But if you look at other regions in the country, these are characterized by rising poverty and inequality rates, regions like the Upper East and then the Northern regions. Interregional inequalities are also noted to be widening. This is because poverty generally is falling in richer regions while it's increasing in the poorer ones. We can also look at the trends in poverty and inequality when we look at it by the gender of the household head. We can see that poverty in male-headed households, represented by these blue bars, has been falling over time, compared, and it's also higher than the poverty levels in female-headed households, as indicated by the orange bars in the graph on the right. We can also look at inequality trends by male-headed and then female-headed households. We see that inequality tends to be higher in male-headed households, although over time it appears to be rising in both these 2 types of households, both male and then female-headed. Now, as Anna already pointed out, so a lot of, when we think about poverty, we tend to try to measure this using monetary matrix, and a lot of the speakers have already alluded to this. But I think that it's important to also try to get at a different measure of poverty using sort of a multidimensional index. Now, it's important to note that just last year in 2020, Ghana's Statistical Service came out with its first multidimensional poverty indicator. So what it did was to try to generate, and this of course measures Ghanaians' access to social amenities, public services. And so what the GSS did was to use a number of different dimensions and then 12 indicators. And so a household was defined as being multidimensionally poor if it was deprived in at least a third of these indicators. And it's interesting to note that if you use the monetary metrics for the country, it says that about 25% of Ghanaians are poor. But using the multidimensional indicator, this almost doubles. then we see that about half of all Ghanaians are actually multidimensionally poor. Now, we have been seeing decreases in multidimensional poverty in the country over time, but there remains unequal access to many basic services. Now, on this slide, I'm showing the percentage of deprivation for households within the country. And we can see that the highest deprivation is observed in areas of sanitation and then health insurance when we look across the 12 indicators that are used to construct the country's multidimensional poverty index. So about 44% and 40% of Ghanaians respectively are multidimensionally poor in safe sanitation and then in health insurance. Now, a lot of the story on poverty in Ghana tends to be spatial. So we see that even though I'm not showing it, we see higher multidimensional poverty in rural versus urban areas, and then in the northern parts of the country versus the southern parts of Ghana. I'm also showing a multidimensional poverty on this slide by gender. And again, you can see that across the 12 indicators, a higher proportion of male-headed households appears to be deprived in many more of these indicators compared to female-headed households. So not to take up too much time, to answer the question, no, I don't think rising inequality is acceptable, even if it coincides with poverty reduction. This is because, as I believe Kanika already pointed out, a widening gap between the poor and the rich can lead to social problems. It is true that poverty reduction could dampen some of these effects, but I'm not convinced that it could totally eradicate them. Additionally, when we see inequalities in access to these social amenities and then public services, sometimes it can be a factor in rural-urban migration. And of course, as we know, we can lead to increasing prevalence of an urban poor population as a result of limited job opportunities, for example. Now in Ghana, we do have a number of policies that have been designed to reduce poverty, and because they are designed to favor the poor, they also have implications for inequality. So policies like the NHIS, livelihood empowerment against poverty policy, and then free senior high school policies, and also during the height of the lockdown, we had certain COVID-related policies that were meant to try to reduce poverty and then also reduce gaps between the poor and the non-poor within the country. So I'm happy to stop here, and then I'm looking forward to the questions and then the discussions that will ensue. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nkechi, and thank you for bringing in the discussion of the multidimensional poverty index. I think that's a really valuable addition to highlight that once we include these multi-dimensions, poverty is actually higher, and so maybe, you know, the poverty reductions are not as extreme as what can be painted if we don't take into account the multidimensional poverty index and the factors associated with it that you so clearly laid out in your nice graph there. So that finishes our main presentations. And so we've left intentionally 45 minutes for discussion. And I think like maybe as a very brief summary, I feel like pretty much all of our presenters said no to the question that is the title of our session, that is rising inequality acceptable if it coincides with poverty reduction. And so everybody has pretty much said no. And most of the presenters circled this towards the ethics of inequality and how rising inequality can generate social unrest. And Marcello bringing in gender inequality there as well as the sort of social inequality. So, but I wanted to ask maybe Murray and David or the presenters just to sort of kick off the discussion of, so we heard all the reasons why no, this is not acceptable, but was there some reason why we thought that maybe it could have been acceptable? So is there something, just to sort of make sure that we have a balanced discussion of, like, maybe are there some factors that could make it rising inequality acceptable if it is, if it does coincide with reducing poverty? What would be some of the theoretical? We've heard a lot of the reasons why it's not acceptable, but maybe David, Murray, want to pipe in and say, when would it be acceptable? And then maybe we can then launch into a sort of a balanced discussion. David, go. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, I'll jump in and I guess kind of be devil's advocate a bit. I think all the points made were excellent, and I don't disagree with any of them. But I think it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that there have been really impressive declines in poverty around the world in the last 50 years. So World Bank estimates are something like 50% of the world was in poverty in 1981 when they start doing their series, and that number is down to 9% or below 10%. And that's for their $1.90 a day kind of most extreme poverty measure. And of course, there's many other ways to measure it, and many issues to discuss there. I think, in fact, if you add other dimensions, it in fact looks even better in the sense that access to electricity, to water, declining infant mortality, just throwing out sort of a hodgepodge of things that one might think about. Infant mortality has declined incredibly over this time. Malnutrition has declined. And so we could say, well, suppose you first learn that fact and say, well, that's great. And I think I'm often pointing out, I have very good, well-educated friends in the Ann Arbor community who actually challenged me on this. They could not believe that poverty had gone down. They were quite sure it had gone up. And I think everybody in this group, hopefully quite familiar with the data that, in fact, these are quite impressive declines, differently impressive in different areas. Very big declines in China, pretty impressive declines in India, Africa, not quite so much, but still declining. And as Murray and Nkechi pointed out, Africa is a case where we see kind of a weaker relationship between economic growth and poverty decline. But on the other hand, there is poverty decline, so we don't want to forget about that. So then suppose you learn that and say, well, that's great. And then say, well, yeah, but inequality went up. How should we feel about the rising inequality? And basically, we should feel bad about it. I think everybody's made the point. There's lots of bad things about inequality, and we don't like to see it go up. On the other hand, if the counterfactual was, well, suppose we hadn't had that economic growth and hadn't had the decline in poverty, and hadn't had the increase in inequality, would we be happier? And I think the answer is no. That is, if this was the only way to have economic growth and the only way to reduce poverty, then I think we have to live with the inequality. Of course, the point many people have made is, wouldn't it be nice if we could have had that economic growth and poverty decline without the inequality? And of course, the answer is yes. But the kinds of economic growth that we've had around the world, inequality tends to come with it sometimes. And it's, I guess, if you had to choose, like, get the economic growth, accept the inequality, and get the poverty reduction, and then try to deal with the inequality in the long run, would just be my kind of devil's advocate argument. Looks like others have comments, so I'll let others go.
Yeah, I see Anders' hand up, but I just want to look to Kathleen's comment in the comments. And Kathleen, are you able to use your microphone to say your comments?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. Okay, just to kind of put myself out there and maybe be a bit provocative. I think a lot of discussion around inequality kind of clouds a few things. One is countries like Brazil, or South Africa, which have very extreme levels of inequality, are very different than context with maybe much more what we might call moderate levels comparatively across countries. So I don't want to confound my comment with like Brazil or South Africa. The second thing where I think often happens with inequality discussions is the confusion, not confusion, but mixing the concept of inequality with people living at very low absolute levels of living standards. And you could have a country with very low poverty and very high inequality where everyone is above some threshold. But I find in a lot of discussions around inequality, people conflate the idea of inequality with people being at the low end of a tail, and that tail being very low itself. So lacking services, for example, critical services, and I'm talking multidimensional poverty, not just monetary. And I think that nuanced separation needs to happen because inequality is a measure of distribution, right? It's not saying anything about living standards. You could be in very unequal places and be very well off from an absolute perspective. And so I think conflating the two leads to people to kind of associate inequality as always a bad thing because they associate it with living below some standard of living. And then finally, I think, you know, it's informative to look at how growth and initial inequality explain pathways and poverty reduction patterns, but those I think we have to keep in mind those are mechanical relationships. And so saying if we had less inequality, we would have greater poverty reduction with some given level of growth, I don't know that it's very useful because it's very mechanical. It's you know, it's really about where is the growth and how the growth plays out. And again, it's not that I think the poverty, inequality, growth triangle is not useful to talk about, but when the mechanics become, you know, kind of equated with a clear policy path, I think is really problematic because it's often not. It doesn't kind of clearly tell you a pathway forward on policy. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Joycelyn. Thanks for the presentations too. I joined a little late. I apologize. I missed the early part. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen, for joining us. It's always really interesting to hear perspective, especially for those who don't know, Kathleen's at the World Bank. So it's really valuable to hear your perspective. And I thought, you know, you dropped in there the comment about sort of inequality has the capacity to, you know, you hear of this concept of othering, that it makes those who are at the bottom end of the tail feel like they're the others compared to those at the top end. And I think that that can be a pretty powerful driver of in the ethics of inequality. I just hear it's hard to hear me again, so I've tried to change my headset. I will now try to speak up. So we've got lots of hands up. I'm really excited to hear it. Anda, should we loop back to you, and then I'll go down the queue that I have that's mounting here, and see. You've just taken your hand down. Is that because you?
Yeah, but it.
Okay. Great.
Yes, it's just because actually I had raised my hand because I had a question back to David. Well, two questions actually.
Yes, to David's discussion, the devil's advocate.
It's because when David, when you say that the kind of growth that led to this huge poverty reduction has also increased inequality, my question is, okay, what is the counterfactual? How are we sure that another type of growth wouldn't have led to the same poverty reduction or even higher poverty reduction? So that is one question. And the other one is linked to what you said at the end, because you mentioned that you know, if we have this high inequality, it's not that probably that bad because we have important poverty reduction, but we also see that we reach a level where we can't achieve more poverty reduction. And this is linked to inequality because we do know what could reduce further poverty. And it's linked to both within country inequality, but most maybe importantly to between countries inequality. And it's also the fact that we are reaching this level of inequality that makes us, I would say, incapable of further reducing poverty. And again, it's linked to inequality in terms of voice, in terms of representation, etc. So I will just stop here.
Yeah, let's loop back to David to. And then
well, just a quick answer. we're not that good at managing economic growth. I mean, these are not planned economies, these are market economies for the most part. And so you think of like, well, suppose you could flip a switch and like turn on globalization of the kind that we had, which is basically what happened. We sort of flipped a switch and turned on massive globalization. What would that do? I think it would do exactly what happened, which is you would have massive declines in poverty in the countries that started producing all kinds of stuff like China and India and many other places. You'd have a lot of people that got really well off from jumping into that business in the countries, entrepreneurs and traders and so on. Their incomes would probably go up faster than the people sewing the clothes. But in the whole, it would be a massive success. You'd have a huge decline in poverty. You would have as a side effect a lot of people getting really rich from getting into this business. And then you have a choice, like, do you flip the switch or not? It's very hard to like say, well, I want to flip the switch, but I want to somehow like keep the inequality from happening. That's not a good option. So that's just kind of the hypothetical I'm throwing out. I'm saying if I had to choose whether to flip that switch or not, I would flip it.
I see Monica's hands up, and I'm going to be a bit naughty and go out of order here, if that's okay, and let Monica jump in. Monica, do you want to?
Yes, thank you very much, Jocelyn, and thank you to all the panelists for a very, very interesting presentations and discussions. As you said, to play the devil's advocate and just to keep the conversation balanced, it can be asking myself if it's how useful it would be if countries, particularly developing countries, could prioritize between reducing poverty and reducing inequality. So I ask this because if you look at a country like Ghana, for instance, I wonder if maybe, yes, we have experienced growth, poverty reductions over time, and we have also realized that inequality has reduced marginally, even though we would want to, have inequality go down a bit more. But I was just wondering, given the presentation that Nkechi made on the multidimensional poverty, so those are the non-monetary aspects of poverty, and knowing that most of, or you could say the driving force of inequality in Ghana could be on, let's say, opportunities, for instance. And when I say opportunities, I mean access to basic amenities, for instance. So if the country focuses on dealing with the issues of making opportunities more equal to people, that would definitely reduce poverty. But then eventually, would we see that impacting on inequality? So I'm just wondering if maybe countries, depending on their specific context, may want to prioritize reducing poverty and then later on dealing with the issues of inequality. So I guess it goes back to what Kathleen was saying before, so these are my initial thoughts, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share this.
Thanks, Monica. I'm going to ask Tom Legrand to step in now.
Okay, I had just a couple quick comments, just to come back to what a lot of people have already said. I think an awful lot of this depends on how you define poverty, how you define inequality, what is the degree in the context. If you're talking about a rural society where one family starts to really innovate and get rich, inequality is going up. Is that a bad thing? Clearly not. If you're talking about an extraordinarily unequal situation like northeastern Brazil, it's not the same context. It's also who and how you define social welfare function, which I think Neri brought up. And if it's all defined by relative income, once you can barely survive, clearly inequality is the worst thing. A lot of it depends on definitions that we haven't really drawn out. I think another thing is, how do they interact in the real world? Right? If you have a policy you can do that will increase growth by a great deal and maybe thereby increase inequality, but everybody's being drawn up, and then eventually you're going to catch up. Is that a big problem versus other things? One thing that the economists tend to overlook, it's kind of viewed as this is outside of our domain, but some people do look at it, is if you're in a situation of extreme inequality, We're thinking about the dynamics, how they interact, but they interact within the rules of the game. And if the real rich can start changing the rules of the game, they can affect governance. Tad Homer Dixon spoke of this with the, I think, what happens when you have, I think it was real problems, population growth and impact on a competition for scarce resources, natural resources. And he was saying, well, the rich can take the scarce resources and they are enriched themselves. This is not the standard rules of the game of economists, but this is the standard rules of the game of the world to a certain extent. And I think we have to look at issues of governance, which complicates everything, and the ability of the real rich to affect governance and take a larger part for themselves. And that can change the entire result of what we're seeing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom, and to Monica previously. And I just wonder if Kanika or Nkechi or both of you have any comments for Monica or Tom.
Well, I was going to comment on the question you asked before. You know, you asked whether, since we all seem to take the same point of view, were there any potential arguments in favor of rising inequality. And I think when Tom was talking, he alluded to one aspect that I had in mind, and that's the issue of innovation, right? There is sort of a moral inclination not to embrace too much inequality, but at the same time, I think that it can serve as a type of motivation, right? So for people to take more risk, to try to be more entrepreneurial, all of that. So in that sense, I do see some benefits to rising inequality. But then, you know, I was thinking about the point I think that Kathleen raised earlier on in the chat box, where she said that, you know, shouldn't people be compensated, you know, if they are better educated, for example, and you would think that that is fair. But then this goes back to the point about the inequality of opportunities, right? So I couldn't help thinking about, you know, the case of the discovery of oil in Ghana, for example, right? So we saw a lot of growth within that period after 2011, but the distribution was very unequal. And why was that? Because very few people had the capacity to actually enter into that sector and then experience or experience some of the economic growth that the country was enjoying. But we know that there's also differential access to educational resources, right? So you are compensating people who may already be privileged with higher incomes. And that's, I think, where the morality comes in. Not everybody starts off at the same place. So I'm back to this. So yes, I see benefits for inequality, but then when you look at the entire experience, especially at the level of my country, you can't help but see that it's not the full story. The inequality of opportunities also plays a big role, and that's why perhaps we push back so much against this widening gap between the rich and the non-poor and then the poor. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Kanika, did you have some comments at this stage?
Yes, so I have 2 points here. So one, I think, just following up on what Kathleen said. So, you know, in fact, there is evidence that has also shown that you know, that inequality. So people revolt against inequality when they think that inequality is born out of unfair means of resource appropriation. So I think it's important to sort of to distinguish between the two. There is some level of inequality that is acceptable because there are going to be different returns to different kinds of people. People who are more innovative, they are likely to get higher returns, but you know, there has to be a threshold to that. And you know, countries like India, which have like, you know, a very high level of inequality, in just if you include total income inequality, I don't think that's the only story. The story is also that wealth begets more wealth. If you're already rich to begin with, you're more likely to even get richer because you're reaping returns which are sort of unrealistic because of the general market, or etc., the current market situation. So I think one point was that no, I think the whole premise against inequality is whether it's being generated through unfair means or is it just being generated through fair means. The second point here is that actually I should have mentioned that in my presentation as well. I wasn't very clear, but the existing results which have shown that higher or lower inequality affects future growth paths as well, they in fact find nonlinear impacts, as Kathleen pointed out, that there is a certain level of inequality that is fine for the society. It's only when you exceed some very high threshold that it actually begins to hurt your growth prospects in the future. So just wanted to make those 2 points, just to answer some of the questions that actually Kathleen had raised. Some of them were actually very important.
Kathleen, your name gets called out a lot. I'm just wondering, do you have a couple of comments?
Well, I think the thing I'm struck by with the inequality discussion, it's not a new one, obviously, and having thought about it a lot in the context of particularly sub-Saharan Africa, I'm really struck by how hard this work is to do, because I think that, it's just very hard to tease out, for example, the negative consequences of high inequality. I mean, we resort to, as I was mentioning earlier, these mechanical relationships. If a distribution is wide, fewer people at the bottom will benefit, et cetera. But this notion of even the social cohesion impact of inequality or the underlying unfairness in society, it's very hard to measure. We know it's there. We just don't know exactly how to measure it and exactly where those turning points are. How much inequality is too much inequality? I think it's in some sense, it's kind of easy to look at Brazil and South Africa and say, clearly there's too much. I don't know where the line is, but we're kind of over the line, I believe. But then in lots of other settings, it's much harder to pin down. And I'm struck by, really at the end of the day, how hard this work is to do. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, to Nkechi's point about oil in Ghana, we do know, I think pretty clearly, that the macroeconomic gains from natural resource production, by and large, just rarely get distributed in general, let alone to people at the bottom of the income distribution. So Nkechi, your point that that lots of people can't really gain from that macro income, I would argue it's not just poor people, it's even people in the middle of the distribution do not gain from it. It really goes to a very select few. And where I think we have the strongest case to have concern about growth that leads to inequality and some poverty reduction is the macroeconomic growth that comes from natural resource accumulation, because there we do have theories and some empirical evidence that wealth leads to distortions in urban settings and general job creation distortions that hold back both poverty reduction and kind of increasing welfare on average. But in other domains around, say, social cohesion, I mentioned earlier, I think it's just much harder to pin down, much harder to measure, and to know when things have kind of run amok, if you will. Not run amok, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but off course. I also want to add, I was really struck, Nkechi, by your presentation on Ghana, and Monica, you mentioned this also. The multidimensional measure, which of course is very welcome and I think a great added depth to what we get from monetary poverty. But what I'm really struck by in Ghana in particular, I guess, is how much of the multidimensional poverty is being driven by, I think, what is ultimately community-wide infrastructure. So particularly sanitation, water, sewage. And these factors are interesting because they're not ones that a singular household can easily address, right? They are at the community level. They're on par with building a road. And why I think that's interesting is that there's maybe more of a place for the government to really step in, as opposed to in the job space. We talk a lot about poverty reduction. We talk about jobs and income opportunities and for farmers, for self-employed micro enterprise owners. we really struggle. We struggle with moving the needle on ag productivity and micro enterprise productivity in the non-farm space. But building sanitation systems, you know, it seems like something technically that just doesn't face the challenges of job creation, and it's a critical driver of multidimensional poverty. So in some sense, the solution seems like more readily available right there. That's my impression. But Nkechi, Monica, I don't know if that's how you see it too. Thank you.
I think it's a great point. And yes, Kathleen, actually, if you read the report, it says that the government is sort of picking these types of public services as a way to sort of guide policy in addressing them. So it's almost as if they recognize that it's something that's important to people and it's within their permit to try to solve. So in a way, I agree with you. But then there are other aspects, you know, of trying to get at multidimensional poverty that aren't included. But the argument for the selection of these indicators is that, well, it's something that government can address and it's important to people. So things like jobs, which, as you will know, we're still doing our best to try to address, doesn't make its way into this index. But at least maybe it's a starting point. And the point is to hopefully try and improve, you know, the lives of people across these various indicators. But I certainly would agree with you. They actually stated quite clearly in the report.
Yeah. I think that with Kathleen and Nkechi, and also with Tom mentioning governance, that we're starting to hear some heavy sort of words about this is really difficult work to do, but we've got this concept of sort of responsibility going on as well. And so sort of who's responsible for making sure that we're moving the needle on inequality and poverty. And so placing the responsibility is also part of this equation that we're trying to work in the discussion. And I know Marcello's had his hand up for a long time, so I want to get to him. And I also want to loop to Raphael and to something that Tom mentioned about talking about sort of ecological challenges that Raphael mentions. So sort of talking about climate change and COVID in the context of poverty and inequality. So I want to get to that, and that circles back to Tom. But I feel like I have to loop in Marcello now because he's had his hand up there for a while. So go, Marcello. You're on mute. Unmute.
Thank you. So Brazil was mentioned a few times. I think it's a good example or a bad example. First thing, I think we had the experience, for me, is a strong experience of having growth and inequality fall for a while, which I would not imagine that if you asked me 15 years ago. And now, in the last few years, we are seeing a divergence, you know, inequality going very bad, growth as well, bad recession, etc. So it's really, I think when you are in extreme, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit, but it might get you get misleaded in this path. One thing that I was surprised by Brazil's trajectory is that multi-dimension poverty indicators, as mentioned by Nkechi, fell much more, I wouldn't bet on that, than income-based poverty indicators. I wouldn't, so something, I don't know when now, you know, they're supposed to be more structural, they would last for longer, but the advances, but I don't know about that. What happened in the last years. With the volatility is also one point that we are not subject to inefficiencies. Perhaps you can, you know, you can have more efficiency and more equality if you know, give more markets with to the poor, or not just giving the poor to the markets. And so, and in the case of Brazil, we made an evaluation. About 22% of overall inequality is due to volatility. So this is could be easy, because Brazil is not only very unequal, has not been growing not much in these last years or in the last decades, but also a lot of uncertainty. And just one last point, that we're talking about a lot about social cohesion and things like that. Something that's is coming into the picture more and more is polarization. Polarization is, and polarization, if you you have two concepts, the concept of alienation and identification. There are two sides of polarization. And identification, meaning if inequality within groups fall, which means overall inequality is falling, if you hold the rest constant, polarization is increasing. So maybe, I think, taking Thomas' point, that we should be very specific, when you ask about inequality, overall, is it a Gini? Is it a share prosperity? And the answer might be different. And maybe a fall of inequality may be bad for polarization. You have these us versus them type of situation that may be more, you raise more conflict. Okay.
Thank you, Marcello. You're highlighting to me that you're quite the poet. So two comments there, giving the markets to the poor and not just the poor to the markets. It's like, oh, you're very poetic with that statement. It's very bold. And then with the polarization and the edification versus the alienation, I see your next career here as a poet. So I don't know if people want to pick up on that, or if I can invite Raphael to verbalize his comment that he has in the comments section. If people want to respond to Marcello, put your hand up, or if I should turn to Raphael. Okay, I'm going to say, Raphael, are you able to join us, or would you like me to read your comment out? I particularly wanted to pick up on the ecological challenges from Raphael. Okay, so I'm going to speak on behalf of Raphael. So one thing that I wanted to point out, so Raphael said that could greater equality and poverty reduction help societies face the ecological challenges and other crises that already exist, for example, COVID, and others that will appear in the future. So I kind of wanted to pick up on this and how climate change fits into all of this. Tom mentioned it a little bit, and then this sort of concept of responsibility, governance. I don't know, how does it all intertwine? Does anyone want to pitch in on how, pick a topic, climate change or COVID? I won't make you cover everything all at once. But how do these sort of overarching themes fit into our discussion today? Murray, can I call on you to lead those thoughts, or you want to label somebody else? Oh, Anda's got her hand up. Go, Anda.
I'm very happy to to have Murray also, but maybe I can also ask Murray, if I may, if you want to maybe react to what Marcel said and on the polarization, because what this brought to mind is our results in South Africa, where we actually see that economic inequality has practically not moved. Wealth within groups, inequality has increased by a lot. So I would love to hear Murray's inputs on that. And now I just wanted to react a little bit on the ecological part, because I think, some of the literature actually says that more cohesive and less unequal societies are more resilient to crisis, be it climate change or COVID. And there are some results that show, for instance, that in less unequal societies, policy changes specifically regarding the protection of biodiversity are more easily passed. We also have contradicting examples, and especially when you think less on the adaptation side of climate change and more at the mitigation side. When you think about, for instance, the middle class protests regarding the reduction of subsidies, fuel subsidies in Nigeria, when also you think about the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is more of middle class protesting. So I think it doesn't, I know, it's not as much about inequality per se as it is about the social contract in place, which are probably impacted by the level of initial inequality. So yeah, that's all what I wanted to say.
Thanks, and I think, Murray, it's your turn to pipe in now, and you've been called upon.
Yeah, I don't have the awesome rap. Yeah, and there are others in the room that would have a lot to add to. I'm not putting you on the spot, Amy Thornton, but I sort of am. But you know, so what Marcelo's notion of this polarization, and it's the sort of, and I think you know, and this the broader forces of growth. What are they doing? So one of the you know, if you take you know, Kathleen's got a vision and made a crucial point. If you think about the African many African societies, African economies that were languishing in the no growth scenario, extremely poor, nothing going on basically. And then, you know, and so from the 1990s onwards, we had the forces of growth at last sort of engaging with the continent, and that's breathing a life. And then there's incentive points, and then there's opportunities for people. That's a type of a scenario where it's, you know, where almost, you know, you were equally poor in the beginning. So any growth process is going to, you know, increase inequality to some extent. And then I think that the sort of the texture of, okay, what really happened then under that? So in many, how are those resources used? So somebody made the point earlier that one thing that growth does is it can put some resources in the hands of the state to use the resources. And so some social protection systems were increased. And so the growth, poverty elasticity in most countries around the world was way higher for the very poor, for those below the $1.95 poverty line, than it was for the slightly higher poverty line, which is very indicative of where the growth is reaching. Now, how did it reach there? That's the key point, in a sense, you know, because, you know, and then why isn't it reaching still very, very poor people, but marginally above $1.95? Because in a sustainability sense, you don't have a sustainable society if you're not including those people as well. And you know, and you know, previously I've heard Marcelo talking about the Brazilian experience and how the spatial inequality that Nkechi raised, Marcelo raised, one of the remarkable features of the Brazilian experience was that these areas that had been excluded from the growth process were included in, you know, in the reduction in inequality, and so the inclusion, there was an inclusion aspect to this thing into the growth process that was very crucial, and that then changes into the middle classes. It makes a transformative change in the society. Whereas in many African contexts, and certainly in a South African context, so I think, let me just make the point this way. I thought that Kathleen raised this issue exactly right. We've got these thresholds where we understand that South African society is like out there, off the charts with its inequalities. But nonetheless, but what is it about that society that makes us so sure that this, basically it's the fact that we're very, very sure that the inequalities are such that they're stifling the country's potential, basically. And the dynamic processes of growth don't change any of that in any real way. They change it in ways that are very thin. So as Anda said, so in South Africa, the within racial inequalities increased after apartheid. But nonetheless, the changes in the racial changes of the society are extremely thin. And that's a sustainability issue, I think. So we've got these issues, but nonetheless, given COVID and given where we are right now, it doesn't stop the hard economic angle coming into the growth, poverty, inequality nexus. Everybody's, obviously we're very concerned that there's no growth in the society. And it's making people say, okay, but it doesn't matter that our inequality has constrained our growth to top out at 4.5%, even in a very positive growth phase. People still don't want to confront the inequality and the foundations of growth. So the sort of threshold points that Kathleen was talking about, which are very crucial, well, what are they? I think these are the key issues, actually. This isn't really it's not a statistical debate, it's a consequential debate about how livelihoods work in any society. And the fact that polarization is happening, certainly in African contexts, polarization is happening in many societies, is a sign of unsustainable societies, in a sense. It's a sign of inequality in certain dimensions being a serious problem and constraint. Thanks.
Thanks, Murray. I thought your sentence that inequality is stifling countries' potential was a very powerful comment, and that growth doesn't change that. And then leading to your concern about this focus on growth in the post-COVID, or we're not even post-COVID now, in our COVID era. So thank you for that. We have 3 minutes. So Amy, you were called on. I don't know if you want to pipe in. David, I don't know if you want to come in under for last comments in our now 2 minutes remaining. Amy, are you able to join us for 1 minute? Hello. I'll take that as a no. She's not able to come off mute.
I think she has right of refusal. That's fair. Good.
Okay. Anda, since you opened us up, did you want to say a last few words to close up the discussion?
Why not? I think that what you said regarding Murzumak, that inequality is stifling countries' prospects, and we are. I think that sometimes we might have the impression that the discussion is going too much towards inequality versus poverty, especially recently. But I don't think we should see them as being separate. And as again, as the international development community, we should also maybe put a bit more interest and more efforts into actually looking at what happened. David mentioned that poverty has been reduced a lot recently. Beyond globalization, we would need to understand what is needed right now. We know that growth has to change because of ecological constraints, because of the pandemic. We know that we need to make things differently if we want our societies to be sustainable. So it would be also a good moment to think about what is the kind of growth that allows us both to reduce poverty and to reduce inequalities, or at least have a level of inequalities that could be sustainable, could maybe be acceptable, and what that level is. Yeah, I'll probably just stop here. I know if maybe David wants to come in.
We're actually at our 12:30 on the dot. So I don't know if for the conference's perspective, we have to close off our session and thank all of our participants.
I think the Zoom rooms are left open.
Yes,
you can
exactly.
talk a little
So
more if you want.
Let everybody know that this is the POP panel that we will continue off record for half an hour or so after this official session. So if people want to stay on the line to chit chat with, you see the people with the videos on, this is part of the panel. If you wanted to stay online, you're so welcome to do so. But I think now I will officially close the session unless somebody else tells me otherwise. And so to thank our participants and everybody who joined us for this really valuable discussion. I've learned a lot in this hour and a half, and although disappointed not to be in Hyderabad, I was so glad to be able to bring together this talented team. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all in the rest of the ICP conferences.